Alright, so because the video was getting to be too long, I've broken this video up into 3 parts. So this is part 2 of 3. If you haven't seen the first part, go check that out. I'll link it right here as well as in the description. Without further ado, let's jump right back into Johnny Harris Lies on the U.S.-Mexican War.
But not everyone actually agreed that the map looked like this.
You're right. The Mexican government went back on their word. They violated the treaty they had with the Texas government. They claimed that, while it was a treaty signed at the point of a gun and it was never technically ratified by the Mexican Congress, so it's not a valid treaty. And that's such a ridiculous argument on its face. Number one, virtually every treaty in history is negotiated at the point of a gun. Does that make it not valid? Should the United States still belong to Great Britain just because we forced Lord Cornwallis off the continent at the tip of a bayonet? Is the Confederacy still in existence just because Robert E. Lee was forced to surrender at the point of a gun? Of course not. They lost. The Mexicans lost. Why Victus? Woe to the conquered. The losers in history should expect no mercy and ask for none. The Mexican government, in a mad grab for land, decided to change the borders on a whim with the United States from the Rio Grande, like 100 miles north, to the Nueces River. Given their deceptive and treacherous nature, it's no wonder you identify with them, Johnny.
While Mexico conceded that they lost the war, they disputed this map, saying that the border of the new Republic of Texas was actually here.
Actually, formally, the Texas government was not recognized by the Mexican government. It was still regarded as a province in rebellion, even though the Mexican government had signed a treaty stating otherwise.
And that all of this was still Mexico. So now you have a big land dispute between Mexico and the Republic of Texas. Well, soon it's 1845 and Texas becomes the 28th state of the United States. And yet this land is still disputed. But now it's a land dispute between the United States of America and Mexico. Let's keep in mind that despite all of this map drawing, there are still loads of native peoples who have lived on this land for years and are now being suffocated by all these nations trying to take their land.
Okay, just because you make a claim, and this doesn't even have to be related to territory, but just because you make a claim doesn't mean it's true. Case in point, Johnny, you know what? Your house actually belongs to me. How dare you cross into that disputed territory? How dare you occupy that territory? I claimed it as mine. Now, obviously, that would be ridiculous on its face. So why doesn't the same hold true with this territorial dispute? In the same way that you have a deed to your house, or, the mortgage company in all probability has a deed to your house, there is a treaty stating that the Rio Grande is the border between Texas and Mexico. And what is your point with this whole Indians still lived there thing? Like, cool, good to know. I didn't think they left.
Again, that's another episode, and it's an important episode, and I want to do it justice. But for now, what happens next in the Mexico story gets kind of nuts. And the reason it gets kind of nuts is mainly because of this guy, President James K. Polk. James Polk wins the presidency and comes into office with a list of 4 big things he wants to do. It's his big wish list.
Are any of these things immoral? Is it wrong to want to acquire more territory? And you have to remember that the Bear Flag Revolt was a thing. Like, California already tried to become independent from Mexico. It was one of the several rebellions I mentioned earlier.
Top of this wish list is Polk's desire to capture this very specific part of Mexico, which is called California. Remember that at the time, the U.S. didn't actually stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The U.S. had colonized portions of Oregon Territory, but it was kind of confusing because they were kind of competing with the French and the British, and they didn't actually own it yet. But you'll notice that Oregon was also on Polk's shortlist. But first, California. He first tried to buy California from Mexico for $25 million. Mexico flat out said no. So Polk decides to pull an incredibly dirty move. Remember this big old swath of disputed territory that the U.S. inherited when they admitted Texas into the Union? James Polk was pissed off that Mexico didn't take his offer to buy California. So he sends a small group of troops into this disputed territory.
Okay, you are intentionally mischaracterizing that chain of events there. And yes, generally speaking, public opinion was probably against the sale of the territory to the United States in order to settle debts that they owed to the United States. But bear in mind that Mexico was really in no place to negotiate anyway. Do you have any idea how many revolts and rebellions and revolutions they had and what the level of corruption was like at that point in time? They were barely a functional government. And the degree to which the Mexican government disputed the territory to begin with seemed to be predicated on who exactly was in charge. And that whole disputed territory thing, even if it were a more legitimate dispute, that's a two-way street. You know who sent troops to the disputed border first? Mexico, right on the Rio Grande. You want to know where the American army camped for a good chunk of time? On the Nueces River, well within their territory. Furthermore, it wasn't a small detachment of American soldiers. It was a whole army of a couple thousand men under General Zach Taylor.
And has them march right up to here, right across from the river that separates what everyone agrees is Mexico. But according to Mexico, they've already been in Mexico as soon as they crossed into this disputed territory, which...
Yes, the Americans mobilized an army in their own territory in response to the mobilization of a foreign army with designs on their territory being right on their border. And again, this isn't even a legitimate excuse. This is the Mexicans reneging on a treaty and trying to claim that they had territory that they know they did not have right to, because it damaged their national pride to not have that territory, to having lost it to the Texans and then later the Americans.
Mexico believes is theirs. So the Mexican army is sent to respond to what looks like an oncoming attack from the United States. This is exactly what Polk wanted. A group of 1,600 Mexican soldiers attack this small group of 80 Americans, killing 11 of them and capturing the rest. They easily won since they were outnumbered by like a magnitude of 20. But this is exactly what Polk needed to get his wish list going.
No, the Mexicans sent their army across the Rio Grande into what they knew was disputed territory, as you'll claim, or rightfully American territory. And you know what they did on that land? They didn't try and engage in a fair fight the army that was right there on the Rio Grande. No, they ambushed a patrol of 70 men. And you want to know what would have happened if they hadn't attacked Americans on American soil? Probably nothing. If they had stayed on their side of the Rio Grande, this whole issue probably would have been resolved diplomatically at some point or another, avoiding the war entirely. But no, the Mexicans committed an act of war, and so war they got.
After this battle, Polk goes to Congress and reports that the Mexicans have, quote, invaded our territory and shed American blood upon American soil.
This is an objectively true statement.
Even though this wasn't necessarily American soil.
Nope, this is a true statement per the Treaty of Velasco, which Santa Anna signed.
It was disputed territory that most people thought was rightfully Mexico.
Citation needed. How do you figure most people thought it was Mexican territory? That's just not true. And even if it were, it doesn't matter how many people think it's the truth.
But it didn't matter. The death of Americans was enough to rally Congress around declaring war with Mexico.
Yeah, generally speaking, invading a neighboring country's territory and killing their soldiers on said territory is usually enough to rally a nation to war.
The U.S. easily won this war, and they did it pretty quickly.
What precisely do you mean by quick and easy? For starters, the war lasted for almost 2 years. Also consider that at this point in time, the professional military of the United States was very small. The majority of the troops who saw action in Mexico were largely untrained and undisciplined, certainly ill-suited for combat. Moreover, the United States had virtually no expeditionary military experience at this point in time. Also consider that American troops were a lot more susceptible to the diseases found in Mexico because they had little to no exposure to those diseases. And this is to say nothing of the supply difficulties the Americans certainly faced trying to keep a well-supplied army on the march, hundreds or thousands of miles away from any actual logistical base. And mind you, every single battle the United States fought against Mexico was against vastly superior numbers. Mexico had also spent the majority of its history engaged in war. True, this caused internal instability, but there were probably a larger percentage of the Mexican army that had seen some form of combat than the American army. Indeed, it would seem that the only advantage the Americans truly had over the Mexicans was martial brilliance and a disciplined and well-trained officer corps. I'll give to you General Winfield Scott's fixed opinion on the matter. I give it as my fixed opinion that, but for our graduated cadets, the war between the United States and Mexico might, and probably would have lasted some 4 or 5 years with, in its first half, more defeats than victories falling to our share. Whereas, in less than 2 campaigns, we conquered a great country and a peace, without the loss of a single battle or skirmish. The graduated cadets, of course, referring to the recent graduates from West Point who had taken part in the war. And the martial brilliance of Scott's landing at Veracruz cannot be overstated. The Duke of Wellington, the man who famously defeated Napoleon at Waterloo, upon hearing that Winfield Scott and the Americans had attempted such a landing at Veracruz, remarked, "Scott is lost," meaning that, in the Duke of Wellington's estimation, there was no way that Winfield Scott and the Americans could pull off a victory here. They were surely doomed to starvation and defeat. Instead of defeat, Scott and the Americans took what was considered to be the strongest fortress in America at the time and advanced on Mexico City. In tandem with the actions of General Zach Taylor's army in the north of Mexico, this is truly one of the finest hours in American military history. So to say that victory came quick and easy is just downright disrespectful and wrong. Not just to the Americans who conquered that great nation, but also to the Mexicans who fought to defend it.
Remember that the taking over of Texas was originally a bunch of settlers who band together, made a militia, fought Mexico on their own, and declared the Republic of Texas. Not super great, but...
What makes this quote-unquote not super great? What's wrong with it?
At least it wasn't like a government leader sending his soldiers in that he knows are going to lose to provoke another country to kill those soldiers so that he can use democratic processes and institutions to make war, all so that he can take over land from that country.
You and I both know that this is a gross mischaracterization of what happened, but what's disgusting is most people don't know that, and you're intentionally providing them with false information so they jump to the wrong conclusion. President Polk dispatched an entire army comparable in size to the Mexican army massing at his border. Where do you get off saying he knew they were going to lose? They lost one engagement, which was an ambush when they weren't even at war. And it's not like this was a defeat of the entire army. This was a defeat of a very small section, a patrol the Americans had sent out. And he's not hijacking a democratic process, you nonce. Look, the duly elected Congress of the United States, having been presented with all the same facts that James K. Polk was presented, decided to go to war with very few dissenters, most of whom were only dissenting for political reasons. They were concerned that the capture of any Mexican territory would bring new slave states into the Union, upsetting their balance of power. It's not like the Congress of the United States back then is all that different from the Congress of the United States today. People are arguing over and disagreeing on and dissenting to things not on their merits, but for other political ramifications. And dispatching soldiers to your own border is not provoking another country to war. And even if this had been some sort of Machiavellian ploy to obtain territory in California, it's not as though James K. Polk himself shot American soldiers and then blamed it on the Mexicans. They shot and killed American soldiers on American soil. They made it real easy for him to get the excuse he wanted, as you so claim. Even if your lie were true, which it's not, the Mexicans made their own bed, so now they got to lie in it.
I mean, Polk really wanted California. Jeez. There were critics of this at the time, one of whom was this guy, who said that letting Polk force the country into war with Mexico was, quote, allowing him to make war at pleasure.
That's pretty ironic considering how Lincoln decided to make war at his own pleasure against a nation who had done nothing to him, save for not being bound by the political structure which had tied them together in the past. But like I said earlier, people opposed the war for reasons that may not have entirely had to do with the war itself. It's because it was politically expedient, just how virtually nobody was against the war in Iraq at its outset, but virtually everybody was against it by its end. Politicians always will and always have done what is politically expedient, and Abraham Lincoln is no exception. And in any case, that's just one man's opinion on the matter. Is it possible that Abraham Lincoln might have had a wrong opinion? Alright, right here's a pretty good stopping point. We're going to break it off and pick it back up with part 3 at a later date. As always, feel free to leave a comment, question, concern, death threat, whatever you got, I'll take it.